There is a narrow stretch of road that drops from the high hills around Jerusalem down toward Jericho, cutting through a gorge so steep and so shadowed that even at midday the sun barely touches the bottom. The walls rise on either side like the sides of a grave that someone forgot to fill in. For thousands of years, travelers have called the path through it by different names. But the oldest name, the one a shepherd boy gave it, long before kings or empires or maps, was simply this: the Valley of the Shadow of Death. You have heard those words before, maybe at a funeral, maybe stitched onto a pillow, or framed on a wall in your grandmother's hallway, sitting next to a picture of a lamb and a shepherd's staff. The 23rd Psalm is probably the most memorized passage in the entire Bible, and also, possibly, the least understood. Here's what most people miss. This is not a poem written by someone imagining what comfort might feel like. This is not a verse composed in a quiet study by a man who had never been afraid. This is not a greeting card. This is a field report, written by a man who had walked through that actual valley, who had slept in those actual caves, who had been hunted by an actual king with an actual army, and who, somehow, on the other side of all of it, sat down and wrote 6 verses that have outlived every empire that ever tried to kill him. His name was David, and before he ever picked up a sword, he picked up a shepherd's staff. Before he was hunted, he was the one doing the watching over sheep, in hills not far from where he would later run for his life. Stay with me, because there is a detail buried in this psalm, something about that valley, about who else would one day walk down that same road. And by the end, you're going to see it land in a way that might catch you off guard. To understand what David meant, you have to go back before the crown, before the giant, before any of it, back to a hillside outside a town so small that nobody bothered writing its name down except by accident. That's where this story actually starts. Bethlehem was not a place anyone expected anything from. It was a farming town, small enough that everyone knew everyone. And when the prophet Samuel showed up one day looking for the next king of Israel, a man named Jesse lined up 7 of his sons for inspection. 7. Tall ones, strong ones, the kind of sons a father would be proud to present. And Samuel looked at every one of them and said, "No, not this one. Not this one either." Finally, Samuel asked Jesse if that was all of his sons. And Jesse, almost as an afterthought, said there was one more, the youngest. He was out with the sheep. That's where David was. Not in the house, not in the lineup. Out in the fields, alone, doing the job nobody else wanted. While his future was being decided without him, in a room he wasn't even invited into. If you've ever felt like the biggest decisions about your life were happening one room over, without you in it, hold on to that feeling, because that's exactly where this story begins. You can imagine what that felt like. Left out, forgotten, the kind of overlooked that gets into your bones. And it's that exact experience, the experience of being the one left out in the field, that David is remembering when he opens this psalm with 4 words. The Lord is my shepherd. In Hebrew, the word for shepherd is ra'ah, and it means a great deal more than someone who herds animals from one field to another. Ra'ah means the one who feeds them when they can't feed themselves, the one who searches for them when they wander, the one who fights for them when something comes to kill them. David knew that word from the inside, because he had been that person out in the field doing exactly that for years, while no one was watching. So when David writes, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," he is not writing a pretty metaphor. He is saying, the God of Israel does for me everything I used to do for sheep that couldn't take care of themselves. And if you've ever felt forgotten, passed over, left in the field while everyone else got picked. That's exactly the kind of person this psalm was written for. But it gets stranger, because David's job in that field was not safe. In one account, David later tells King Saul, almost casually, that when a lion or a bear came after the flock, he went after it. He chased it down, he struck it, he pulled the sheep out of its mouth with nothing but a wooden rod, the same rod a shepherd carried every single day. You may never have fought off a lion, but you know what it feels like to face something bigger than you, with nothing in your hands but what you already had. Think about that for a second. The rod that shows up later in this psalm, "Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me," was not a decoration. It was a weapon David had personally used against animals that could have killed him. When David says the rod comforts him, he is not talking about a symbol. He is talking about a tool that had already saved his life more than once. Here's the part nobody tells you. That same rod is mentioned in the same breath as something much gentler, green pastures and still waters. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. If you've never spent time around sheep, this sounds like a postcard. But sheep are not like other animals. A sheep will not lie down if it is afraid, or hungry, or if there is another sheep above it in the pecking order standing too close. And a sheep will not drink from moving water, not because it doesn't want to, but because the sound and motion of a fast stream terrifies it. A thirsty sheep will stand at the edge of a rushing creek and die of thirst rather than drink from it. So a shepherd had to find, or sometimes build, quiet pools, calm water. And he had to clear the field of threats before the flock would ever lie down. When David writes that God makes him lie down and leads him beside still waters, he's describing a level of care that goes far beyond food and water. He's describing someone who removes the things that make you afraid before you even knew they were there. Someone who notices that you can't rest and does something about it. There's one more piece to this. The next line says, "He restores my soul." In Hebrew, the word for soul here is nephesh, and it doesn't mean some small spiritual piece tucked inside you. Nephesh means your whole life, your appetite, your breath, your will to keep going. When a sheep collapsed from exhaustion, or wandered off and got stuck, sometimes literally flipped onto its back, unable to get up on its own, the shepherd had to physically lift it, turn it over, and walk it back. That's restoration. Not a feeling, a rescue. And once that sheep was back on its feet, the psalm says God leads it in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Shepherds in the hill country around Bethlehem knew certain paths, narrow tracks worn into the hillsides by generations of flocks before them. These paths weren't always the shortest route, but they were the safest ones. The ones that avoided the cliffs, the loose rock, the places where a sheep could fall. For his name's sake is easy to read past, but it matters. David isn't saying God guides him because David deserves it. He's saying God guides him because of who God is. The same way it would damage a shepherd's reputation in the village to lose sheep on a path he knew was dangerous. The guidance isn't about David's performance. It's about the shepherd's character. So far, everything in this psalm has come from the world David already knew. Fields, water, paths, a rod in his hand. But the next verse is where the psalm takes a hard turn, because the next verse is the one everyone has heard at funerals, and it's the one almost nobody understands. Before we go there, quick pause. If you're seeing how much is packed into verses most of us read in about 10 seconds, you're going to want to see what's coming, because the next part of this psalm gets personal in a way you might not expect. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this series. and drop a comment telling me which detail so far surprised you the most. Now, into the valley. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. In Hebrew, the phrase translated shadow of death is one word, tzalmavet. It's a combination of shadow and death, and it shows up in other places in the Old Testament to describe something very specific: deep ravines, places so narrow and so steep that daylight barely reaches the floor. Not a metaphor for dying, a real kind of place, a real kind of darkness you could walk into with your own body. And David knew exactly where those places were, because for years he lived in them. After David killed Goliath, the Philistine giant who had terrorized Israel's army for 40 days, you might expect David's life got easier. It didn't. King Saul, the very king David served, became consumed with jealousy. Saul threw a spear at David in his own house. He sent soldiers to kill him in his sleep, and eventually, David had no choice but to run into the wilderness, into caves, into exactly the kind of shadowed ravines that Psalmaveth describes. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing centuries later, described this same region, the wilderness around the Dead Sea and the hill country of Judea, as a landscape of caves and cliffs and hidden gorges, the kind of terrain where a man could vanish for years if he knew where to hide. You don't have to imagine hiding from someone who wants you gone. Some of you have lived something close to it: the fear of a phone call, a knock on the door, a name on a screen you didn't want to see. This is the world David is remembering when he writes, "The valley of the shadow of death." Not a vague fear of dying someday, a specific memory of actual nights spent in actual darkness, with an actual king and an actual army hunting him. During those years on the run, David wasn't entirely alone. Saul's own son, Jonathan, risked his life more than once to warn David when soldiers were closing in. Even though loyalty to his father should have placed Jonathan on the opposite side, in the middle of David's valley there was still a hand reaching toward him. And here's where it gets remarkable. David doesn't say, "I will not walk through the valley." He doesn't say God kept him out of it. He says, "Though I walk through it." Present tense, ongoing, unavoidable. I will fear no evil. Not because the valley wasn't dangerous. It was. Lions lived in those hills. Saul's soldiers searched those caves. The darkness was real. But David says the fear doesn't win. For you are with me. 4 words. You are with me. Not, you got me out. Not, you prevented this. With me. In it. This is the turning point of the entire psalm. The moment the language shifts from describing what God does to describing where God is. Up until now, every verse has been about provision, pastures, water, restoration, paths. But the valley verse is about presence, and those are not the same thing. If you've ever sat in a waiting room at 2 in the morning, if you've ever gotten a phone call you knew was going to change everything before you even answered it, if you've ever walked into a room you didn't want to walk into, a hospital room, a courtroom, an empty house, you know there's a difference between someone fixing the situation and someone simply being there with you in it. David isn't promising the valley disappears. He's promising you don't walk through it alone. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Remember the rod, the one David used against the lion and the bear? And the staff, a longer tool, often with a hook on the end, used to guide sheep. Pull them back from the edge of a cliff, or hook them by the leg and draw them close. 2 tools, one for protection, one for guidance and correction. David says both of them comfort him. Not just the rod, the weapon, also the staff, the tool that sometimes had to pull a sheep back, even against its will, even when the sheep didn't want to go where it was being led. Correction in this psalm isn't separated from comfort. It's part of it. Pay attention to this because it's about to come full circle. Everything so far, the fields, the water, the valley, the rod, has been about David as the sheep and God as the shepherd. But the next verse flips the entire picture. Suddenly, David isn't in a field anymore. He's at a table, and the language changes from shepherd language to host language. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. In the ancient world, sharing a table wasn't just about food. It was a public declaration of relationship. If you ate at someone's table, especially if that person was a king, everyone watching understood exactly where you stood with him. Protected, claimed, safe. And David knew exactly what that kind of table could mean, because years later, after he became king himself, David did something almost nobody in the ancient world would have done. Saul the king, who had hunted David through caves and ravines for years, eventually died in battle. By every rule of how kings operated in that era, David now had every reason and every opportunity to wipe out anyone left from Saul's family. That's simply how it was done. A new king eliminated the old king's bloodline, so no one could rise up later and claim the throne. But David asked a different question. He asked if there was anyone left from Saul's house, anyone at all, so that he could show kindness to them for Jonathan's sake. And there was. Jonathan's son, a boy named Mephibosheth, crippled in both feet since childhood, from an accident during the chaos that followed Saul's death. He had spent his whole life hidden away, likely terrified that one day David's soldiers would come for him, because that's what kings did to the children of their enemies. Instead, David brought him to the palace, and David told him, "You will eat at my table for the rest of your life." Think about that scene. A man with a physical disability, the grandson of the king who tried to kill David, the son of a family that, by every political logic, should have been eliminated, sitting at the king's table. Every single day, eating the same food as the king's own children. In the presence of David's enemies, the people who would have expected Mephibosheth dead, David set a table for him instead. You may never have been the grandson of a king's enemy, but you know what it feels like to believe you don't belong somewhere, and then to be told, against everything you expected, that you do. That is what "Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies" means. Not a meal that happens despite your enemies watching. A meal that happens because of what your enemies are watching. A public, undeniable statement: this person belongs to me now. Nobody touches him. "Thou anointest my head with oil" was part of how a host honored an arriving guest. Oil for the head was a sign of welcome, almost like a host saying, "You are not just tolerated here, you are celebrated here." And "my cup runneth over" wasn't a metaphor for vague abundance. It was the literal posture of a generous host, pouring wine until it spilled over the rim, on purpose, because holding back would have insulted the guest. The last line of the psalm ties it all together. "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." The Hebrew word translated mercy here is chesed, and it's one of the richest words in the entire Old Testament. Chesed isn't just kindness, it's loyal love. The kind of love that keeps showing up on purpose again and again to someone who has no claim on it and no way to pay it back. It's the love David showed Mephibosheth. And David is saying that exact kind of love follows him, chases him down every single day of his life. Now remember that valley from the very beginning, the narrow gorge with the high walls where daylight barely reaches the bottom. That same road running down from Jerusalem toward Jericho, through that same shadowed ravine becomes the setting centuries later for one of the most famous stories Jesus ever told. A man beaten and left for dead on that exact road, and a stranger who stopped to care for him when no one else would. In centuries after that, Jesus describes himself using the same word David used at the start of this psalm. I am the good shepherd. Jesus says, the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Not a shepherd who sends someone else into the valley first, a shepherd who walks into it himself. If you've ever sat in a hospital hallway at 3 a.m, waiting for a doctor to come back, waiting for a phone to ring, waiting for someone to tell you whether everything is about to change, you know what Psalmaveth feels like. Even if you've never heard the word before tonight. The walls feel close. The light feels far away. And the only thing that makes it bearable is not being there alone. This is not a psalm about avoiding the valley. This is not a psalm about being too important for the valley. This is not a psalm about a shepherd who points the way and sends you in by yourself. This is a psalm about a shepherd who walks into the valley with you and a king who sets a table for you on the other side. In front of everyone who said you'd never get one. So what do you do with all of this? Here's the first thing. Psalm 23 was never written as a poem for the dying. It was written by a man who had been overlooked, hunted, and nearly killed more times than he could count, and who came out the other side convinced that he had never once walked through any of it alone. Here's the second thing if you are in a valley right now. And you know if you are, this psalm isn't telling you the valley is fake, or that it will disappear if you believe hard enough. It's telling you that presence, not just rescue, is the promise. The rod and the staff are still in his hand. The shadow is real. So is the one walking through it with you. And here's the third, the one I want you to sit with. David, the shepherd boy nobody picked, ended up at a table prepared by a king. And Mephibosheth, the broken grandson of David's enemy, ended up at that same kind of table, not because he earned it, but because someone chose chesed, loyal love, over what he deserved. If that's true for him, it's true for you too. The table isn't reserved for people who never needed a shepherd. It's prepared, especially for people who did. So here's my question for you. Which line in this psalm hits differently now that you know where it came from? The rod and the staff, the table in front of your enemies, or the valley itself? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. The Lord is your shepherd, you shall not want. And whatever valley you're walking through right now, you are not walking through it alone.